Deep within the forbidden woods of Oakhaven, a single choice shattered my quiet life. Nursing a mangled, dying beast should have been a death sentence. Instead, it bound my soul to a monster who ruled the shadows. You never truly know what hides beneath a fragile human disguise. The year the rot came to Oakhaven, the winter was merciless, and the laws of Lord Prescott were even worse. I was Beatrice Harding, the 21-year-old daughter of the village apothecary, and my hands were permanently stained with the green sap of yarrow and the dark earth of the forest. My father Thomas was a good man, but a fearful one. He had spent my entire life warning me never to cross the boundary stones into the deep woods. Beyond those stones lay the territory of the Lycan's beasts of nightmare, who, according to the tavern whispers, tore men limb from limb and bowed only to a mythic, terrifying tyrant known as the Alpha King. But fear does not cure the coughing sickness that was tearing through our village, and the only place the lungleaf fern grew was beyond the boundary stones. It was dusk, and a freezing rain was turning the forest floor into a treacherous mire. I had my hood pulled low, clutching my woven basket against my chest as I navigated the slick roots of ancient oaks. The silence of the woods was heavy, suffocating. That was my first warning. The birds had stopped singing. The crickets were dead silent. Then I heard it. It was a wet, ragged sound, a terrible rattling gasp that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand at attention. I should have run. The penalty for being caught in the deep woods by Prescott's guards was a whipping. The penalty for running into a wild beast was death. But the healer in me, the foolish, empathetic core that my father always cursed, rooted my boots to the mud. I crept toward the sound, pushing aside a thick thicket of thorny briars. In a small clearing surrounded by churned earth and splintered branches lay a monster. I clamped a hand over my mouth to stifle a scream. It was a wolf, but impossibly large, the size of a draft horse. Its fur was a striking blend of midnight black and silver, matted heavily with dark, glistening wetness. But it wasn't the sheer size of the creature that made my breath hitch. It was the brutal state it was in. The beast had been shredded. Deep, jagged claw marks tore across its massive ribcage, and protruding from its hindquarter and shoulder were 3 black, fletched arrows. I recognized those arrows. They belonged to the king's elite huntsmen. The arrowheads were forged of pure silver. The creature's chest heaved with agonizing slowness. One golden eye cracked open, locking onto me. The intelligence in that gaze was staggering. It wasn't the feral panic of a dying animal. It was the cold, calculating fury of a sentient king brought low. A low, rumbling growl vibrated through the mud beneath my knees, but it ended in a pathetic, choking whimper. If I leave it, it dies. I thought my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. If I save it, it might kill me. But looking at the silver eating away at its flesh, scorching the edges of its wounds with a sickening hiss, I couldn't walk away. I dropped my basket and fell to my knees in the freezing mud. "I am not going to hurt you," I whispered. My voice, trembling so violently I barely recognized it. The wolf snapped its massive jaws, weakly a warning, but it lacked the strength to lift its head. I reached out my fingers, brushing the wet, coarse fur. The beast was burning up, radiating a feverish heat that fought against the freezing rain. "This is going to hurt," I warned, wrapping both my hands around the shaft of the silver arrow lodged in its shoulder. I braced my boot against the beast's massive leg and pulled. The wolf threw back its head and unleashed a roar that shook the pine needles from the trees, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony. I yanked the arrow free, the silver tip coming out with a sickening squelch. I quickly tossed it aside and moved to the other two, repeating the gruesome process. With every extraction, the wolf thrashed weaker and weaker, until it finally lay entirely still, panting heavily. I reached into my satchel, pulling out a heavy glass jar of dittany and comfrey salve, the strongest coagulant my father brewed. I slathered it ruthlessly into the gaping wounds. As the herbal paste neutralized the remaining silver residue, a miraculous, terrifying thing happened. The massive beast began to shudder. The sound of cracking, snapping bones echoed through the clearing, sickening and rhythmic. I scrambled backward, terrified, slipping in the mud as the black and silver fur seemed to melt away, pulling back into skin. The monstrous proportions shrank, realigned, and morphed until the beast was gone. In its place lay a man. He was unconscious, entirely unclad, and built like a war god carved from stone. His skin was deeply tanned and crisscrossed with a road map of old battle scars, but the new gaping wounds I had just treated mirrored the ones on the wolf perfectly. He had thick, dark hair, plastered to his forehead by the rain, and his jaw was set in a hard, uncompromising line, even in unconsciousness. Panic seized my throat. Nursing a wolf was madness. Hiding a lichen man was high treason. I couldn't leave him in the open to freeze, nor could I carry him all the way to my father's house. Desperation fueled my next move. A half-mile away sat an abandoned trapper's root cellar, hidden beneath an overgrowth of dead ivy. It was close. It had to be enough. I pulled off my heavy woolen cloak and draped it over his massive frame. Grabbing him under the arms, I used every ounce of strength I possessed to drag him through the mud. My muscles screamed, my lungs burned, and the rain washed our tracks away as quickly as we made them. By the time I managed to haul him down the earthen steps into the dry, pitch-black cellar, I was sobbing from sheer exhaustion. I lit a small tallow candle I kept in my satchel, illuminating the cramped space. I wrapped him tighter in the cloak, packed his wounds with fresh bandages made from my own apron, and prayed to every saint I knew that I hadn't just invited death into my life. For 5 days, I lived a dangerous double life. By day, I was Beatrice, the dutiful apothecary's daughter, grinding herbs and ignoring the boastful advances of Walter Prescott. Walter was the local magistrate, the son of the Lord, and my father's choice for my future husband. Walter was a cruel, arrogant man who smelled constantly of stale wine and cruelty. Lately he was more insufferable than usual. The king's huntsman passed through the tavern last night. "B," Walter boasted one afternoon, leaning against the counter of our shop and trapping me in the corner. They ambushed a pack of northern demons, said they took down a high-ranking beast, maybe even a commander. If I find it bleeding out in my woods, I'll bring you its pelt for a winter coat. I forced a smile, my stomach twisting into a cold knot, and politely excused myself. By night, I snuck out to the root cellar. My patient had remained locked in a terrifying fever dream for the first 3 days, thrashing and muttering in a harsh, guttural language I couldn't understand. But on the 4th night, when I descended the earthen stairs with a bowl of warm broth and a fresh lantern, I found him awake. He was backed into the far corner of the cellar, a broken piece of wood gripped in his massive hand like a dagger. His golden amber eyes, the same eyes from the wolf, locked onto me with a predatory intensity that stole the breath from my lungs. The sheer physical presence of him in the small space was overwhelming. Even injured and sitting in the dirt, he exuded an aura of absolute command. "Who are you?" His voice was a deep, gravelly baritone that vibrated right through the stone walls. "Beatrice," I stammered, holding up the wooden bowl defensively. "I saved your life. You had silver in your shoulder and thigh." He lowered the wood slightly, his eyes narrowing, as he scanned my face, my dirt-stained dress, and the bowl of broth. He touched the crude bandages on his chest, wincing slightly. "Why didn't you kill me?" he demanded. "Your kind slaughters mine for sport." "I am a healer," I said, finding a scrap of courage. "I don't slaughter anything. Now sit down before you tear my stitches, you ungrateful brute." A flicker of surprise crossed his face, followed by the faintest hint of an amused smirk. He tossed the wood aside and slid down the wall, clutching his side. "What is your name?" I asked, kneeling beside him, to hand him the broth. He hesitated, his golden eyes dropping to the wooden spoon. "Arlo," he said softly. "What were you doing in our woods, Arlo?" "Dying mostly," he replied dryly, drinking the broth in quick, ravenous gulps. When he finished, he looked at me. "I am a rogue. My pack cast me out. The huntsman found me wandering alone. That is all." I knew he was lying. A mere rogue wouldn't carry himself like a deposed emperor. But I didn't press. Over the next week, a strange, unspoken bond formed in that damp cellar. I changed his bandages, and we talked in hushed whispers. Arlo was guarded, but under his gruff exterior was a sharp, biting wit and a surprising tenderness. He would watch my hands work with a fierce, quiet intensity. The physical tension between us grew palpable. Every accidental brush of our fingers sent a rush of heat up my arm. I found myself counting the hours until the sun set, rushing through my chores just to get back to the dark, freezing cellar. But the illusion of our secret sanctuary shattered on the 7th night. I had left the village later than usual. Walter had been loitering around our home, demanding my father set a wedding date, and I had nearly lost my temper. I practically ran through the woods, carrying fresh bread and a jar of honey. I was only 50 yards from the cellar when the shadow detached itself from the trees. It was a lichen, but not like Arlo. This one was entirely in its beast form, but it was scrawny, matted, and smelled of rotting meat. A true rogue. It stepped into my path, a low growl, rumbling from its throat, drool dripping from its yellowed fangs. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The basket slipped from my fingers, scattering the bread across the moss. The rogue lunged. I screamed, throwing my arms up, but the impact never came. A blur of movement slammed into the rogue from the side with the force of a battering ram. It was Arlo. He was still in his human form, half-dressed in a stolen linen shirt of my father's, his bandages visible. But he moved with supernatural speed. He didn't shift into a wolf. He didn't need to. He grabbed the rogue by its throat with one hand, lifting the massive beast entirely off the ground. What happened next defied everything I knew about rogue wolves. Arlo didn't strike the beast. He just looked at it. His golden eyes seemed to flare in the darkness, and a suffocating heavy pressure suddenly filled the air, an invisible weight that drove me to my knees. It was an aura of pure, absolute dominance. The feral rogue stopped struggling instantly. It let out a pathetic, high-pitched whine, tucking its tail tightly between its legs as it dangled in the air. Arlo spoke a single word in that harsh, guttural language. The rogue whimpered. Arlo tossed the beast aside like a broken toy. The wolf hit the ground, scrambled to its feet, and fled into the darkness without looking back. I knelt in the dirt, hyperventilating, staring at the man I had been nursing. No mere outcast could force a rabid rogue into submission with a single look. Arlo turned to me, the ferocious glow fading from his eyes, replaced by a sudden soft panic. In 2 strides, he was in front of me, falling to his knees and framing my face with his large, warm hands. "Are you hurt, Beatrice? Look at me. Are you hurt?" His voice was frantic. "No!" I gasped, looking up at him, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm. "Arlo, what was that?" "Who are you?" He didn't answer. He just stared at my lips, his chest heaving, the adrenaline of the fight practically radiating off his skin. I should have left days ago. I am putting you in danger. He whispered, his thumbs tracing my cheekbones. Don't leave. The words tumbled out of my mouth before I could stop them. The distance between us vanished. Arlo kissed me. It wasn't the hesitant, clumsy affection of the village boys. It was desperate, consuming, and territorial. His hands tangled in my hair, pulling me flush against his solid chest, and for a long moment, the fear, the woods, and Walter Prescott ceased to exist. I kissed him back with equal desperation, anchoring myself to the beautiful monster I had pulled from the mud. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. He rested his forehead against mine in the dark. Go home, Beatrice, he whispered softly, before I ruin you entirely. I did go home, my lips swollen and my mind racing. I barely slept. At first light, I packed a larger satchel, determined to run away with him, to hide him properly. But when I reached the root cellar, it was empty. The only sign that Arlo had ever been there was a heavy object left, sitting squarely on a clean wooden barrel. I picked it up, my blood running cold. It was a massive, solid gold signet ring. Engraved on its face was a snarling wolf, wearing a crown of thorns, the royal crest of the Northern Ridge Pack, the crest of the Alpha King. 3 weeks. For 3 agonizing weeks, the heavy gold signet ring rested against my collarbone, hidden from the world by a leather cord and the high collar of my wool dresses. The metal always felt unnaturally warm against my skin, a constant burning reminder of the monster I had saved and the man I had kissed in the dark. Arlo was gone, and the brutal reality of my life in Oakhaven crashed back down upon me with terrifying force. The winter deepened, and with it the cruelty of Lord Prescott. The coughing sickness had claimed 10 more villagers, and rather than opening the manor's food stores to help the sick, the Lord doubled our taxes. My father Thomas, a man who had dedicated his life to healing the very people Prescott abused, finally reached his breaking point. He refused to pay. He stood in the village square and loudly declared the taxes were a death sentence for the poor. By nightfall, my father was rotting in the damp, rat-infested dungeons of Prescott Manor, charged with treason against the local magistrate. That was when Walter made his move. He strutted into the apothecary the next morning, smelling of expensive spiced wine, his riding boots tracking dirty snow across my freshly swept floor. He didn't offer condolences. He didn't offer a fair trial. He offered a bargain that made my blood run cold. The dungeons are no place for a frail old man, B. Walter purred, leaning over the wooden counter. The damp air will put the coughing sickness in his lungs by the weekend. But as the magistrate, I have the authority to grant a pardon, a wedding gift, if you will, to my new bride. The trap had snapped shut. If I refused, my father would die in the dark. If I accepted, I was condemning myself to a lifetime of misery, shackled to a sadistic coward. I touched the fabric of my dress, feeling the hard, round shape of the wolf's crest beneath it. I thought of Arlo's fierce, protective eyes. But Arlo was a ghost, a myth who had vanished into the snow. I had to face the reality in front of me. Tomorrow, I whispered the word, tasting like ash in my mouth. Release him tomorrow, and I will marry you. The wedding was organized with sickening speed. The following afternoon, the sky over Oakhaven was a bruised, heavy purple threatening a blizzard. The entire village was forced to gather in the stone courtyard of the manor to witness the union. My father, shivering and pale, stood guarded by 2 heavily armed huntsmen. I wore a simple grey dress, my hands trembling so violently I had to clasp them tightly together at my waist. Walter stood at the altar, grinning with triumphant malice draped in an expensive fur cloak. The village priest began the vows, his voice echoing off the cold stone walls, but a strange, unsettling vibration began to drown him out. It started as a low rumble like distant thunder, but the ground beneath my thin leather shoes began to tremble. The priest faltered. Walter turned around, scowling, hand resting on the hilt of his silver-plated sword. "What is that racket?" Walter barked to his guards. "Silence them." But the guards couldn't silence an earthquake. Suddenly the heavy iron gates of the manor courtyard groaned in protest. Then, with an ear-splitting shriek of tearing metal, the gates were ripped from their hinges. They crashed onto the cobblestones, kicking up a massive cloud of winter dust and snow. Screams erupted from the villagers. Women grabbed their children, and men fell back as the courtyard was instantly flooded with nightmares. Scores of massive wolves, some slate-grey, others russet-brown, all larger than any natural beast, poured into the courtyard. But it wasn't a feral frenzy. They moved with terrifying military precision, forming a tight perimeter around the humans, cutting off every escape route. Behind them strode figures that made the blood freeze in my veins. Lycan warriors in their human forms. They were towering, broad-shouldered men and women, clad in dark leather armor, carrying weapons forged from a strange matte black steel. The king's huntsmen, the men Walter constantly boasted about, immediately dropped their crossbows. Their silver weapons clattered uselessly against the stone. They were paralyzing, outmatched. Then the ranks of the Lycan army parted. My breath caught in my throat. Walking through the center of the beasts was a man who commanded the very air around him. He wore a sweeping cloak of pitch-black wolf fur over dark armor, his broad shoulders easily clearing the height of the men around him. His dark hair was swept back, and his jaw was set with the ruthless authority of an executioner. It was Arlo. He was no longer the muddy, bleeding rogue I had dragged into a cellar. He was magnificent. He was terrifying. He was the Alpha King of the Northern Ridge. Walter, completely unaware of the grave he was standing in, drew his sword with a trembling hand. "What is the meaning of this?" he shrieked, his voice cracking hysterically. "This is the domain of Lord Prescott. I demand you leave." Arlo didn't even look at him. His piercing golden amber eyes scanned the terrified crowd until they locked onto me. A jolt of pure electricity shot down my spine. The cold, ruthless mask on his face didn't break, but the intensity in his gaze was a brand, a fire that chased away the winter chill. He began to walk toward the altar. The massive wolves stepped aside for him, bowing their massive heads in absolute submission. Arlo stopped at the base of the chapel steps. The sheer proximity of him was overwhelming. The air felt thick, heavy, with the oppressive dominance that rolled off his shoulders. Walter took a step forward, trying to maintain some semblance of authority, though his knees were visibly knocking. "I am Walter Prescott, Magistrate of Oakhaven. You beasts have no jurisdiction here. My huntsmen will—" "Your huntsmen are cowards!" Arlo's voice boomed deep and resonant effortlessly, cutting through the panic of the courtyard. 3 weeks ago, they trespassed into the Northern Ridge. They did not fight me like warriors. They poisoned a riverbed and shot me in the back while the venom burned my veins. A collective gasp rippled through the villagers. The myth of the brave, demon-slaying huntsman shattered in an instant. Walter's face drained of all color, turning a sickly translucent white. "You boast of slaughtering my kind." Arlo continued, taking one slow, deliberate step up the stone stairs. "You wear the furs of our dead as trophies. Today I have come to collect a debt." Walter dropped his sword. It hit the stone with a pathetic clatter. The arrogant magistrate, the man who had tormented my father and forced me to the altar, fell to his knees in the snow, sobbing. "Please," Walter begged, pressing his forehead to the frozen cobblestones. "Take the manor. Take the gold. Just spare my life." Arlo looked down at the weeping man with an expression of profound disgust. He didn't bother to strike him. He simply stepped over the pathetic lordling and stopped mere inches from me. My heart was beating so violently I thought it might burst through my ribs. I looked up into those familiar golden eyes, searching for the man who had kissed me in the damp dark of the root cellar. "I did not come for gold," Arlo said softly, his voice dropping to a register meant only for me. He reached out his massive calloused fingers, brushing against my throat. The entire courtyard held its breath, expecting him to snap my neck. Instead, his fingers caught the leather cord hidden beneath my collar. With a gentle tug, he pulled the heavy gold signet ring out into the open. It caught the dim winter light, the snarling wolf crest unmistakable to everyone watching. "I came for what is mine," Arlo declared, his voice carrying to the edges of the courtyard. The silence that followed was absolute. My father stared open-mouthed, leaning heavily against the wall. The villagers looked on in stunned disbelief. "You left," I whispered, the sting of betrayal mixing with the overwhelming relief of his presence. "You left me in the dark." "I left to protect you," Arlo replied, his thumb gently tracing the line of my jaw, igniting a trail of fire across my cold skin. "I was a wounded target. If my enemies had found me in that cellar, they would have slaughtered you to get to me. I had to reclaim my throne, purge the traitors from my ranks, and make the woods safe before I could return for the woman who saved my life." He looked past me, his gaze finding the guards holding my father. The Lycan warriors flanking Arlo didn't need a verbal command. 2 of them stepped forward, moving with blinding speed. They didn't draw weapons. They simply grabbed the human guards by their collars and tossed them aside like sacks of flour, freeing my father. Thomas Harding. Arlo addressed my father, bowing his head in a gesture of profound respect that made the villagers gasp. "Your daughter possesses a courage that humbles kings. You will never owe a tax to a coward again. The Northern Ridge claims Oakhaven under its protection. No harm will come to your people, so long as the Prescott line is stripped of its power." He turned back to me, extending a large, scarred hand. "I am a man of violence, Beatrice. My world is brutal, and my crown is heavy," Arlo said, stripping away the title and the myth, leaving only the raw, honest truth between us. "But you anchored my soul when I was a beast lost in the mud. I offer you my kingdom, my protection, and what my heart. Will you come with me?" I looked at Walter, still sobbing pitifully on the ground. I looked at the dreary, oppressive walls of the manor that had promised to be my prison. Then I looked at the fierce, beautiful monster who had torn down those walls just to ask for my hand. I didn't hesitate. I reached out and placed my hand in his. "Yes," I breathed. Arlo's fierce exterior broke, revealing a breathtaking, genuine smile. He pulled me flush against his chest, wrapping his heavy fur cloak around my trembling shoulders, sheltering me from the cold wind. He turned us toward the open gates. As we walked through the courtyard, the massive wolves bowed their heads, parting like a sea of shadows, to let their king and his new queen pass. We left Oakhaven behind, riding into the deep, forbidden woods. Not as a captive and a beast, but as equals, bound by a love forged in silver and mud. Thank you for listening to this incredible story of love, betrayal, and destiny. If Beatrice and Arlo's unexpected romance kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you never miss another dramatic tale. Drop a comment below. Would you have saved the rogue wolf in the woods? See you in the next thrilling adventure.